So as you know, Scott Morrison had promised that we would all in this country, if we wanted it, get the vaccine by October. He's now saying such targets are a bit meaningless. We'll see what happens. Let's catch up with Liberal MP Dr Katie Allen. Good to talk to you again, Katie. This is not going well, is it, the vaccine rollout?
Well, I think the principles that we started with regards to this COVID vaccine have stayed pretty stable, and that is that we want this to be safe, first and foremost. And of course, we want it to be free and voluntary. Now, of course, the safety issue, we can't predict. This is a new vaccine. COVID's been around for just over a year, and the vaccine itself, there's been, starting with 150 candidates, we're now down to a handful of frontrunners that are now being rolled out around the world. And this government has had a diversified portfolio of candidate vaccines. And of course, we expected there may be hiccups. So all those things haven't changed. But what has changed is Europe and its ability to fulfil its commitment to Australia and the order that we have for the vaccine supply. So this is a supply side issue, and it is something that is outside the control of the government. So the government knows that we're prepared as we can be with GPs and other vaccine facilities ready to rock and roll, and there is a pent-up demand by citizens. So of course we're all ready, but we can't deal with the supply side issue when it's under the control of the European authorities.
Let's deal with the politics before we get to the substance. And the politics is simply that the Prime Minister overpromised. He shouldn't have promised 4 million vaccines by the end of March. I mean, he promised 4 million. There's about 1 million out there now. It's silly to overpromise and underdeliver.
Well, I'd say that the Prime Minister has a view that we have an abundance of caution when it comes to safety. Perhaps he had an abundance of enthusiasm when it came to supply. Yes. But there are issues that are absolutely outside of our control. I think we're all excited. It only started a month ago. We did say there would be unexpected hiccups. We did understand that every vaccine and every drug has potential side effects. So we've been open-minded and transparent. And we've had a very good open conversation with the Australian public within 15 minutes of the EMA, or the European Medicines Agency, making a different recommendation with regards to the AstraZeneca vaccine. The Prime Minister had called a press conference with the Australian population to let them know this had happened, and to make sure that we are partnering with the Australian public to make sure that we can all get to where we need to get to, which is to ensure that there is a vaccine that's rolled out as quickly and as safely and as voluntarily as possible.
Look, no doubt there's a big political pile-on here driven by the opposition and the media, and it's, you know, there's a lot of fear-mongering with the public. Of course there was a supply problem with Europe, and who could blame the Europeans for wanting to keep as much vaccine as they could for themselves at the moment when you compare the contrasting situations in both countries? But also, when it comes to AstraZeneca, hasn't the government, and aren't too many people talking up the problems here, the AstraZeneca vaccine is perfectly safe, in fact, ideal for the people who need to get the vaccine in Australia now, which is, of course, the elderly. And it's just a matter of getting as much of that domestic supply out there as quickly as possible so that we get all our elderly vaccinated before winter.
Absolutely, Chris. And in fact, that's what I feel very strongly about, is this 1A and 1B, and that they are the most vulnerable in our population. We've got to remember the point of the COVID vaccine is that we want to take this from a serious, deadly disease to a serious nuisance. In fact, we'd like to go away. But I think we've all realised that COVID is probably here to stay and for the foreseeable future. And the Prime Minister has been very clear about there was no silver bullet for COVID. This vaccine is not a silver bullet. It is going to continue to be a problem for us going forward. What we need to do, though, is to take it from being a deadly disease with a very high fatality rate to a nuisance disease. And that's the point about vaccinating those over 70. We know in Australia that those over 70 who got COVID, there was a 10% mortality rate. 1 in 10 people with COVID over the age of 70 unfortunately died. So if we could protect ourselves, protect our vulnerable in this way, then we can move this vaccine to being a nuisance disease like the flu vaccine the flu is. And that is what this vaccine is about. Now, all of the vaccines to date appear to have an equivalence with regards to protecting against death from COVID. So that is a good thing. Now we need to make sure that we get people engaged in understanding that protecting our most vulnerable is what we need to do. And of course, the COVID vaccine rollout is going to allow us to reconnect with the rest of the world. And I really recommend and welcome the National Cabinet's initiative directed by the Prime Minister that the chief medical officers will plan a roadmap for us about how we connect back with the rest of the world, because we don't yet know how the vaccine is going to provide herd immunity. We don't yet know whether it's going to protect against new variants. We don't yet know whether we're going to have a vaccine on an annual basis as we do for the flu vaccine. So there's a lot of unknowns about the COVID vaccine, but what you can be sure about is we have a very clear idea about the safety profile of these vaccines, with 34 million AstraZeneca doses given, a handful, in fact 222 cases of clotting disorders, so that's out of 34 million. And so the risks, particularly for the elderly, of having a bad outcome from COVID far outweigh the risks from the COVID vaccine. And we want people to understand that we will partner with them to make sure that we have a safe and certain supply going forward. And that is what the commitment of the government is to deliver as fast and as safely as possible a COVID vaccine rollout program. And as we move forward, I think you'll find that as we move into a secure supply going forward, then we'll be able to give more expectations around targets.
Sure, it'll ramp up quickly, but very briefly, because there's been a focus on this today, are people with disabilities as a cohort one of the vulnerable groups when it comes to coronavirus?
Well, the aged care and disability sector, including both the workers and the recipients in those sectors, are both part of 1A. So they are part of 1A, and so they
should be getting
our high
briefly,
targeted group.
But they're not.
They should be getting it. But to be fair, they are older people in disability sector, but that sector is not as at risk as the aged care sector. So most of the deaths occurred in the aged care sector. I'm unaware of too many, if any, in the disability sector, and that's partly because it's a much, much younger population. Some of them do have comorbidities and other diseases that are more worrisome from a vaccine point of view, but most of them are in the younger age group, which is why the higher age group, the older age group, is very much where our efforts should be placed at this point in time, while there is a supply issue.
Thanks for joining us again, Katie.
Thank you so much, Chris.